The morning sun painted golden streaks across the marble floors of Kensington Palace as Sergeant Thomas Mitchell adjusted his red ceremonial uniform for what he thought would be another ordinary day. At 52 years old, Thomas had served the royal family for nearly 3 decades, watching princes and princesses grow from toddlers into young adults. His weathered hands bore the calluses of countless hours holding his rifle at attention, and his eyes held the quiet wisdom that comes from years of silent observation. Thomas had seen it all during his service. He witnessed Prince William's first steps in these very corridors, stood guard during Princess Charlotte's christening, and maintained his stoic composure through countless state dinners and royal events. But there was something different about Prince George that had always caught his attention. The young prince, now 10 years old, possessed an unusual awareness for someone his age, often pausing to acknowledge the staff with genuine curiosity rather than the polite indifference that sometimes came with royal training. On this particular Tuesday morning in October, Thomas took his position outside the blue drawing room where Prince George would be having his private tutoring session with Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore, his history teacher. The palace was unusually quiet, with most of the royal family away on various engagements. Prince William and Catherine were attending a charity function in Scotland, while Princess Charlotte and Prince Louis were at their regular school in Windsor. As Thomas stood at attention, he could hear the muffled voices from within the drawing room. Mrs. Whitmore's crisp accent carried through the heavy oak doors as she discussed the reign of Queen Victoria with Prince George. The young prince's responses were thoughtful and engaged, showing the intelligence and curiosity that his tutors often praised in their reports to his parents. Suddenly, the peaceful atmosphere was disrupted by hurried footsteps echoing down the corridor. Thomas remained motionless, his training preventing him from turning to look, but his peripheral vision caught sight of Lady Margaret Thornfield, one of the senior courtiers, approaching with obvious distress written across her usually composed features. "Sergeant Mitchell," she whispered urgently as she reached his position, "there's been an incident in the kitchen quarters. Young James, the assistant chef's son, he's taken quite ill. The ambulance is on its way, but the boy is asking for Prince George. Apparently they've become friends during the prince's visits to the kitchens." Thomas knew about these unofficial visits. Prince George had developed a habit of wandering down to the palace kitchens during his breaks. Fascinated by the bustling activity and the friendly staff who welcomed him with warm smiles and fresh-baked treats. The kitchen staff had grown fond of the young prince, appreciating his genuine interest in their work and his lack of pretension despite his royal status. James Morrison, the 11-year-old son of assistant chef David Morrison, had been particularly drawn to Prince George. The two boys had struck up an unlikely friendship, bonding over their shared love of football and James's impressive knowledge of palace history that he'd absorbed from his father's years of service. James was a bright boy who helped in the kitchens after school, earning pocket money while learning valuable life skills from the dedicated staff. "The boy is quite frightened," Lady Margaret continued, her voice barely audible. "He's been asking for Prince George repeatedly. The medical team says he's stable, but he's worked himself into quite a state. His father is beside himself with worry." Thomas processed this information while maintaining his rigid posture. Protocol dictated that Prince George's tutoring session should not be interrupted for any reason short of a genuine emergency. The young prince's education was carefully scheduled and supervised, with every minute accounted for in his daily routine. Interrupting a lesson would require approval from multiple levels of palace hierarchy, and even then, it would likely be denied unless there was a direct threat to royal safety. The sound of Prince George's laughter drifted through the door, followed by Mrs. Whitmore's pleased response to what was obviously a clever observation from her student. The normalcy of the scene inside contrasted sharply with the anxiety radiating from Lady Margaret as she stood beside Thomas, clearly struggling with the decision of whether to interrupt the lesson. "What exactly happened to the boy?" Thomas asked quietly, his eyes still fixed straight ahead. He was helping prepare vegetables for tonight's dinner when he suddenly collapsed, Lady Margaret explained. The kitchen staff acted quickly, and the palace medical team arrived within minutes. They believe it might be appendicitis, but they won't know for certain until he reaches the hospital. The poor child is conscious, but clearly in pain and quite scared. Thomas could hear the genuine concern in her voice. The palace staff, from the highest courtier to the newest kitchen assistant, formed a close-knit community. When one of their own was in distress, especially a child, it affected everyone. The fact that James was specifically asking for Prince George added another layer of complexity to an already delicate situation. Through the door, Thomas could hear Mrs. Whitmore beginning a new topic about the Industrial Revolution. Her voice carried the enthusiasm of an educator who truly loved her subject, and Prince George's attentive responses indicated that the lesson was progressing well. Any interruption now would disrupt not only the educational flow, but also potentially create administrative complications that could affect future scheduling. Lady Margaret shifted nervously beside him, clearly torn between her duty to maintain royal protocol and her compassion for a frightened child. "Sergeant Mitchell, I know this is highly irregular, but perhaps if we could just inform Prince George of the situation, he might wish to send a message to James, or perhaps—" She left the suggestion hanging, both of them understanding the impossible position they were in. Thomas had spent enough years in royal service to know that even well-intentioned deviations from protocol could have far-reaching consequences. Yet he also understood the unique bond that Prince George had formed with the palace staff and the genuine affection that existed between the young prince and James Morrison. The sound of a chair scraping against the floor came from within the drawing room, followed by Prince George's voice asking a question about working conditions in Victorian factories. Mrs. Whitmore launched into a detailed explanation, clearly pleased by her students' engagement with the material. Thomas made a decision that went against every instinct honed by 3 decades of military and royal service. Without breaking his rigid posture or turning his head, he spoke in a voice so low that Lady Margaret had to strain to hear him. "The drawing room has excellent acoustics," he said simply. "Sound carries both ways through those doors." Lady Margaret looked at him with confusion at first, then understanding dawned in her eyes. If she were to speak about James's condition in a normal conversational tone while standing near the door, it was entirely possible that Prince George might overhear. And if the prince happened to overhear and chose to respond to what he learned, well, that would be the prince's own decision, wouldn't it? The plan was risky and required perfect timing. If Mrs. Whitmore heard the conversation and reported it as a deliberate interruption, Thomas could face serious disciplinary action. But if the information reached Prince George naturally, without any official breach of protocol, then whatever happened next would be beyond Thomas's control or responsibility. Lady Margaret positioned herself near the door and began speaking in a clear, carrying voice about the situation in the kitchen quarters. She described James's condition, his father's worry, and the boy's repeated requests for Prince George. Her tone was natural and conversational, as if she were simply updating Thomas on palace affairs during his guard duty. Inside the drawing room, Mrs. Whitmore's voice faltered slightly as she became aware of the conversation outside. Prince George's responses to her questions became shorter and more distracted. Thomas could almost sense the young prince's growing concern as he processed what he was overhearing about his friend's emergency. The crucial moment came when Prince George's chair scraped decisively against the floor, followed by his clear voice addressing his tutor. "Mrs. Whitmore, I'm terribly sorry, but I believe there's something I need to attend to. Might we continue our lesson later this afternoon?" Mrs. Whitmore's surprised response was barely audible, but her agreement was clear. Within moments, the drawing room door opened, and Prince George emerged with a look of determined concern on his young face. His usual composed demeanor was replaced by the urgent worry of a friend who had just learned that someone he cared about was in trouble. "Lady Margaret," Prince George said, with the quiet authority that seemed natural to him despite his age. "I understand that James Morrison is unwell. I should very much like to see him before he's taken to hospital." Lady Margaret exchanged a quick glance with Thomas, both of them recognizing that they had crossed a line from which there was no return. The young prince had made his decision based on information he had overheard, and now they were all committed to supporting his choice, regardless of the potential consequences. Thomas stepped aside from his post for the first time in recent memory, a simple gesture that spoke volumes about his respect for the compassion he had just witnessed. In that moment, protocol mattered less than the heart of a young prince, who refused to let his friend face a frightening situation alone. The journey through the palace corridors felt different from any Thomas had experienced in his 3 decades of service. Instead of the measured, ceremonial pace that usually accompanied royal movements, Prince George walked with the urgent determination of a young boy rushing to help a friend. Thomas found himself in the unprecedented position of escorting a member of the royal family on an unscheduled, unannounced visit to the service areas of the palace. Lady Margaret hurried alongside them, her phone buzzing constantly with messages that she ignored in favor of keeping pace with the determined prince. The usual retinue of secretaries, security personnel, and protocol officers was conspicuously absent, leaving this impromptu mission feeling both liberating and slightly dangerous. As they descended the stone steps leading to the kitchen quarters, the familiar sounds of palace life grew louder. The clatter of pots and pans, the rhythmic chopping of vegetables, and the constant hum of conversation that characterized the heart of the palace's domestic operations created a stark contrast to the hushed elegance of the staterooms above. Chef Bernard Rousseau, the palace's head chef, emerged from the main kitchen with flour dusting his apron and concern etched deeply into his weathered features. His usual commanding presence was tempered by obvious distress as he spotted the approaching group. "Your Royal Highness," he began, clearly surprised by the prince's sudden appearance, "I must inform you that we have had a situation with young James. His father is with him now, and the medical team is preparing for transport to hospital." Prince George nodded solemnly, his young face showing a maturity that often surprised the adults around him. "May I see him, Chef Rousseau? I understand he's been asking for me." The chef's expression softened as he looked at the 10-year-old prince who had spent countless afternoons in his kitchens, learning about cooking and forming genuine friendships with the staff. "Of course, Your Highness, but I should warn you, the boy is quite uncomfortable and rather frightened." They made their way through the bustling kitchen, where the normal dinner preparations had been suspended as staff members gathered in worried clusters. The usual cheerful banter was replaced by hushed conversations and concerned glances toward the small staff break room where James was being cared for. David Morrison, James's father, stood outside the break room door with tears streaming down his face. The normally jovial assistant chef, known for his quick wit and endless supply of amusing kitchen stories, looked utterly helpless as he listened to his son's labored breathing from within the room. When David saw Prince George approaching, his expression transformed from grief to something approaching panic. In the normal course of palace life, such an encounter would have been carefully orchestrated with proper introductions and protocol observed. But there was nothing normal about this moment. "Your Royal Highness," David stammered, wiping his eyes with his sleeve. James has been asking for you. I know it's highly irregular, but he's quite frightened, and you've been so kind to him during your visits here." Prince George reached out and placed a small hand on David's arm, a gesture that spoke volumes about the empathy that his parents had worked so hard to instill in him. "Mr. Morrison, I'm very sorry that James is unwell. May I speak with him?" The palace medical officer, Dr. Sarah Chen, emerged from the break room carrying her equipment bag. She looked surprised to see Prince George but quickly adapted to the unusual circumstances. Your Highness, James is stable but in considerable discomfort. He's been asking for you repeatedly. I believe seeing you might actually help calm him before we transport him to hospital." Thomas watched from his position near the doorway as Prince George entered the small break room. The sight that greeted them was heartbreaking. 11-year-old James Morrison lay on a makeshift bed created from cushions and blankets, his face pale with pain, but his eyes brightening immediately upon seeing his royal friend. "George," James whispered, using the informal address that would have been unthinkable in any other context, but felt perfectly natural in this moment of crisis. "I was hoping you'd come. I'm quite scared about going to hospital." Prince George pulled up a small chair beside his friend, his movements careful and considerate. "James, I came as soon as I heard you weren't feeling well. Dr. Chen tells me that the doctors at the hospital are very good, and they'll take excellent care of you." "Will you tell me about your history lesson?" James asked weakly. "You always make those old stories sound exciting." For the next 20 minutes, Prince George sat with his friend, sharing stories from his morning tutorial about Queen Victoria and the fascinating characters who lived during her reign. He described the grand balls and the political intrigue, the technological innovations and the social changes that shaped the era. James listened with obvious fascination, his pain temporarily forgotten as he lost himself in tales of a bygone age. Thomas found himself moved by the scene unfolding before him. In his years of royal service, he had witnessed many moments of duty and ceremony, but this display of genuine friendship and compassion touched something deeper. Here was a young prince who understood instinctively that true nobility came not from titles or protocol, but from the willingness to be present for others in their moments of need. The paramedics arrived with quiet efficiency, their professional demeanor softening when they realized they were dealing with a frightened child. Prince George stepped aside to give them room to work, but remained close enough for James to see him. "James?" Prince George said softly as the medical team prepared for transport. "I want you to have this." He removed a small pin from his jacket, a gift he had received during a recent state visit. "It's from the President of France. He told me it would bring good luck to anyone who carried it." James accepted the pin with wonder, his eyes wide with gratitude despite his discomfort. "Thank you, George. Will you visit me at the hospital?" Prince George looked toward Thomas and Lady Margaret, understanding for the first time the complexity of what he was promising. Hospital visits required extensive security arrangements, medical clearances, and coordination with multiple government agencies. But looking at his friend's hopeful face, the prince made a decision that came straight from his heart. "I shall do my very best to see you soon," he promised. "And when you're feeling better, you must come back and help us in the kitchens again. Chef Rousseau tells me you're becoming quite skilled with pastry." As the paramedics carefully lifted James onto their stretcher, the young boy clutched the French pin tightly and waved weakly at his royal friend. The entire kitchen staff gathered to watch the departure, their faces reflecting a mixture of concern for James and admiration for the prince who had abandoned his scheduled activities to comfort a friend. David Morrison approached Prince George with tears once again streaming down his face, but this time they were tears of gratitude rather than fear. "Your Royal Highness, what you've done for my son today. I have no words. You've given him strength and hope when he needed it most." Prince George replied with the natural grace that seemed to come to him effortlessly. "Mr. Morrison, James is a wonderful friend, and friendship knows no boundaries. Please give my regards to your wife, and do let us know how James is progressing." As the ambulance departed from the palace grounds, Thomas realized that something fundamental had shifted in his understanding of royal duty. For 3 decades, he had equated service with rigid adherence to protocol, with maintaining boundaries and preserving the mystique of monarchy. But watching Prince George's actions today, He began to see that true royal service might sometimes require the courage to step outside established boundaries when compassion demanded it. The return journey to the upper floors of the palace was subdued. Prince George walked more slowly now, the weight of his friend's condition settling upon his young shoulders. Lady Margaret fielded several phone calls from palace officials who had discovered the prince's absence from his scheduled activities, her responses careful and diplomatically vague. Mrs. Whitmore was waiting in the corridor outside the blue drawing room, her expression one of understanding rather than irritation. As an experienced educator, she recognized that some lessons were more valuable than any curriculum could provide. "Your Royal Highness," she said gently, "shall we continue with our study of Victorian social reforms? I believe you might find the topic particularly relevant after today's experiences." Prince George nodded thoughtfully, but before entering the drawing room, he turned to Thomas with an expression of genuine appreciation. "Sergeant Mitchell, thank you for helping me understand what I needed to do today. Sometimes the most important decisions are the ones that feel right in our hearts." Thomas straightened to attention, but his response came from a place deeper than military protocol. "Your Royal Highness, it has been my honor to witness your compassion today. Your parents would be very proud of the man you are becoming." As Prince George disappeared into the drawing room to resume his education, Thomas returned to his post with a profound sense that he had participated in something far more significant than a breach of palace protocol. He had witnessed the emergence of a future king who understood that true leadership meant being willing to set aside convention when love and friendship called for action. The afternoon sunlight slanted through the tall windows of Kensington Palace as Thomas Mitchell completed his shift with a heart heavier than usual. News from the hospital had been positive. James Morrison was undergoing surgery for appendicitis, and doctors expected a full recovery. But Thomas knew that the day's events would have consequences that extended far beyond one young boy's medical emergency. 3 hours after Prince George had returned to his lessons, Thomas was summoned to the office of Sir Edward Pemberton, the palace's private secretary. The walk through the administrative corridors felt like a journey to his own judgment, each footstep echoing with the weight of 3 decades of unblemished service that might be coming to an end. Sir Edward's office was a study in understated authority, with its mahogany desk, leather-bound volumes, and portraits of previous monarchs observing from gilded frames. The man himself was known throughout the palace for his diplomatic skills and unwavering dedication to royal protocol. He had served through multiple royal crises, always maintaining the delicate balance between tradition and the evolving needs of a modern monarchy. "Sergeant Mitchell," Sir Edward began without preamble, his tone neutral but his eyes sharp with assessment. "I understand there was an incident today involving Prince George's departure from his scheduled activities. I'd like you to walk me through exactly what happened." Thomas had rehearsed this moment during his remaining hours on duty, knowing that his account would need to be both accurate and carefully worded. He described the morning's events in precise detail: Lady Margaret's arrival with news of James's illness, her conversation near the drawing-room door, and Prince George's subsequent decision to visit the kitchen quarters. "I see," Sir Edward said thoughtfully when Thomas finished his account. "And at what point did you make the decision to step aside from your post to accompany Prince George?" This was the crucial question, the one that could determine whether Thomas's actions were viewed as appropriate initiative or serious dereliction of duty. "Sir, when Prince George expressed his intention to visit James Morrison, I assessed the situation and determined that my primary responsibility was to ensure his safety and well-being. Given the unusual circumstances and the prince's clear determination, I judged that accompanying him was the most prudent course of action." Sir Edward leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers as he considered Thomas's response. The silence stretched uncomfortably as the private secretary weighed the complex factors involved in the day's events. "Sergeant Mitchell, you've served this family with distinction for 29 years, Sir Edward finally said. "Your record is exemplary, and your dedication has never been questioned. However, today's events present us with a rather unique situation." Thomas braced himself for the inevitable consequences. He had known when he made his decision to support Prince George's compassionate impulse that it could cost him his career. But watching the young prince's genuine concern for his friend had made the risk seem worthwhile. "The challenge we face," Sir Edward continued, "is that Prince George's actions today, while admirable from a human perspective, created significant security and protocol concerns. We had a member of the royal family moving through the palace without proper escort, visiting areas that hadn't been secured, and making commitments that will require complex arrangements to fulfill." "I understand, sir," Thomas replied. "I take full responsibility for my decision to deviate from established protocol." Sir Edward studied him for a long moment before speaking again. "What's interesting, Sergeant, is that we've received several calls this afternoon. Prince William and Catherine have been informed of the situation, and their response was rather illuminating." Thomas felt a flicker of hope mixed with apprehension. The Prince and Princess of Wales had always been hands-on parents, deeply involved in their children's moral and emotional development. Their reaction to today's events could determine not only Thomas's fate, but also set precedent for how such situations would be handled in the future. Prince William's exact words were, "If George felt compelled to comfort a frightened friend, then we're proud of the young man he's becoming. We'd rather have a son who bends protocol for compassion than one who follows rules without heart," Sir Edward recounted. Princess Catherine added that they were grateful their son had adults around him who understood the difference between duty and humanity. The relief that washed over Thomas was almost overwhelming. He had served Prince William since the prince was barely older than George was now, and he knew the man's character well enough to recognize the sincerity in those words. "However," Sir Edward continued, his tone becoming more serious, "we cannot simply ignore what happened today. The security implications alone require us to review our procedures and perhaps make some adjustments to how we handle similar situations in the future." Over the next hour, Thomas found himself part of an impromptu planning session rather than a disciplinary hearing. Sir Edward outlined the challenges they faced. Prince George had promised to visit James in the hospital, a commitment that would require extensive coordination with security services, hospital administration, and medical staff. There were questions about media management, public perception, and the precedent that such a visit might establish. "The young prince's instincts are admirable," Sir Edward explained, "but royal visits to hospitals require weeks of advance planning under normal circumstances. We need to find a way to honor his commitment while maintaining appropriate security and protocol standards." Thomas found himself offering suggestions based on his years of experience with royal logistics. They discussed possible timing, security arrangements, and ways to minimize disruption to the hospital's normal operations while still allowing Prince George to fulfill his promise to his friend. As the afternoon wore on, it became clear that rather than being punished for his morning's decision, Thomas was being enlisted to help solve the complications it had created. His intimate knowledge of Prince George's character and his understanding of the palace's operational requirements made him uniquely qualified to bridge the gap between the prince's compassionate impulses and the practical necessities of royal life. "Sergeant Mitchell," Sir Edward said as their planning session concluded, "I'm going to make a recommendation to their Royal Highnesses regarding today's events. I believe your actions, while unconventional, demonstrated exactly the kind of judgment and priorities that we need from those entrusted with the care of our royal family." The following morning brought news that transformed the entire complexion of the previous day's events. James Morrison's surgery had been successful, and he was recovering well. More importantly, Prince William and Princess Catherine had decided to join Prince George for his hospital visit, turning what could have been a security nightmare into a planned royal engagement. Thomas found himself assigned to coordinate with the hospital's security team, a role that felt like vindication rather than punishment. As he worked through the logistics of the visit, he reflected on the lessons of the past 24 hours. The visit to St. Mary's Hospital was scheduled for the following afternoon. Prince George would be able to keep his promise to James, but it would now be done with full royal protocol and security in place. The media would be informed of a royal visit to support pediatric care at the hospital, with James's story serving as inspiration rather than mere spectacle. When the day of the hospital visit arrived, Thomas watched with pride as Prince George demonstrated the perfect balance between royal duty and personal compassion. The young prince spent time with James, delivering not only the promised visit but also books, games, and a personal message from Chef Rousseau and the entire kitchen staff. But Prince George didn't stop with his friend. He spent hours visiting other young patients, bringing the same genuine interest and warmth to each interaction. Thomas observed from his security position as the future king showed an intuitive understanding of how to use his position to bring comfort and joy to others. James Morrison returned to the palace kitchens 2 weeks later wearing the French pin Prince George had given him and carrying stories of his royal friend's hospital visit that he would treasure for the rest of his life. The bond between the two boys had deepened rather than been complicated by the dramatic events surrounding James's illness. For Thomas Mitchell, the experience marked a turning point in his understanding of royal service. He had learned that true loyalty sometimes required the wisdom to know when rules should bend to accommodate higher principles. His willingness to step aside from his post when Prince George needed support had not ended his career, but had instead opened new possibilities for service. 6 months later, Thomas received a new assignment: personal protection coordinator for Prince George's educational and charitable activities. It was a role that recognized his unique understanding of the young prince's character and his proven ability to balance security concerns with the need for authentic human connections. As Thomas settled into his new responsibilities, he often reflected on that October morning when a royal guard chose to step aside. It had been a small gesture in the moment, but it had set in motion events that taught everyone involved valuable lessons about leadership, compassion, and the true meaning of service. Prince George continued his kitchen visits, now with proper security protocols in place, but with the same genuine curiosity and friendship that had characterized his relationship with the staff. His friendship with James Morrison remained strong, built on a foundation of mutual respect and shared experience that transcended the vast differences in their circumstances. The incident became part of palace lore, whispered about in the corridors as an example of how the next generation of royals might balance tradition with humanity. For those who witnessed it, Prince George's quiet yet powerful choice to prioritize friendship over protocol provided a glimpse into the kind of king he might one day become. And Thomas Mitchell, the royal guard who had stepped aside when compassion called, continued his service with renewed purpose, knowing that sometimes the most important duty is simply to make room for the human heart to guide the way forward.